Welcome back. This is the Talk Shop in Studio 255 of the Laramie Plains Civic Center. Our show this morning brought to you in part by Martindale's Western Store, I-80 Towing and Automotive Services, The Human Being of Laramie, and Laramie Range Ford, along with Perkins Restaurant and Bakery, and Wholesale Fireworks, 1438 U.S. Highway 287. And in Studio 255, my guest, candidate for Senate District 10, Keith Kennedy.
Thanks, Eric. Glad to be here this morning.
Good to have you. Hey, we're getting a little later start, so I don't want to delay. For those that are just joining us, this is part of the Candidate Awareness Tour 2024, and this is an important race. United States interests from Wyoming direct in Senate for Wyoming District 10. What's the voter need to know about Keith Kennedy? Introduce yourself, if you would.
I am a semi-reformed farmer. I live north of Laramie, keep a large garden just to occupy myself. We just started a goat dairy. Actually, the first goat started the goat dairy last Monday. I grew up on a farm in northern Colorado and farmed and kept stock for 15 years. I bought a business in Wyoming, contractor, did vegetation control for utilities for the highway department, weed and pest districts. I did that for 10 years, and at the end of that time, I had just wrapped up, finally, my bachelor's here at University of Wyoming. And
what'd you get your bachelor's in?
Agricultural business, and that's how I actually got into what I've been doing the last 21 years as a lobbyist. My advisor told me I was one credit short of graduating if I would work in the governor's office during Governor Geringer's last year, the budget session. He would give me one credit and I'd have my bachelor's done. So I took him up on the offer. The next year, I was actually followed some advice that time, and I was working on a master's in ag business at Kansas State, an executive style program where we spent 2 weeks a year on campus. Everything else was remote. And an exec of one of the groups that I belonged to passed away just before legislature, and that's when I started lobbying. I had kept the other business for another couple of years until the lobbying and government affairs work was built up. And I actually spend probably a third of my time on federal issues that are some of what's formed my opinions that I hold now, too.
In 20 years of lobbying, all in the state of Wyoming?
Yes, and Wyoming is very unique, too, and I have counterparts in other states, but this citizen legislature is very unique in that there is only nonpartisan staff to help legislators draft bills and work through the process, where almost everywhere else they have staff and intermediaries. Here you interact with folks one-on-one.
What are you most proud of in 20 years lobbying? What are one, two, three? What are your three highlights, or one by one? What could you highlight in 20 years of lobbying that you're most proud of influencing?
The thing that I'm most proud of influencing is learning how valuable your word is and keeping your word. And I would say that's one thing that it didn't take too long to learn, but I've known some legislators. I can particularly remember one time where things got contentious in one committee, and I remember the chairman of that committee the next day apologizing for how he behaved, that he felt like he was out of line, and he apologized for his behavior. And I haven't seen a lot of that here lately either.
Forgiven, not forgotten?
Forgiven, not forgotten, but also own up to your mistakes. And really, your word is your bond there, too. I always appreciated much more someone who said, I don't know how I'll vote, or I don't agree with you and I can't go the way you're going, rather than someone that tells me and then I find out half an hour later, nope, that's not
flippy floppy.
Yep. And if I don't know, that's one thing that you also learn as a lobbyist is if you don't know, you better just say so. It's pretty hard to bluff your way through things.
So who finances your lobbying effort? I mean, what are the interests? Do they change one year to another? Do they change topic by topic? Do you go into a legislative session with 10 points of light, or what? How do you roll?
Two of the groups that I represent, I'm their executive director, so I also help put together their annual meetings, and there may be specific points or a bill that they particularly want to push in a given year. It depends. A lot of it depends what's happened at the federal level or things that have happened on the ground. How has business changed? The first group that I worked for was the Ag Business Association. I still work for them. And they're the fertilizer, pesticide, and seed dealers. The second group that I took on was crop improvement, seed growers. And then I've worked some other folks. I helped a group get started last year, the Association of Irrigation Districts. And in this past year, I also lobbied for the Wyoming wool growers. And that sort of fit in with some of my previous life as well. We used to keep sheep when I was on the farm.
So when you lobby, Keith, do you lobby the House as well as the Senate? Simultaneous, type of effort through an entire session, or what do you do? Move from one to the other?
You go back and forth between either end. And attend committee meetings on whichever topics you're following. What we usually do is we pull up a spreadsheet with all of the bills on it, mark ones of interest. The interesting thing is that across industries and in the ag industry, we will all be looking at slightly different things, and everybody has a little bit different perspective, and we often catch things that might be of interest, we know are of interest to somebody else, and call that to their attention. And we also, when we have a similar view on something, we'll also help each other out. If there's 2 committee meetings or 3 committee meetings at the same time, we'll help each other cover bills. And I had also done some work for the conservation districts, and that was part of what we did there. I failed to mention another group, the wheat growers is one that I lobby for, but I also manage the Wheat Marketing Commission, and they almost always have a meeting late January, early February in DC. The conservation district counterpart had a meeting not at the same time out of state, so we'd help each other cover issues.
So what do you want to accomplish as Senate District 10 representative for Wyoming?
The first thing that I'd like to accomplish is to begin to see how we could lessen our dependence on the federal government. It scares me a great deal to see how much the federal debt is costing now. It's over $2 billion a year now, $2 trillion a year, that we're going to spend on interest. And the gravy train's going to stop at some point. And so I think we need to prepare ourselves to be able to handle things on our own. And I know that that's going to be difficult. I also know that we're not going to get there if we don't start anywhere. I think the first place to look in that regard is to start looking at education, because the amount of federal money there in primary and secondary education is a lot lower proportion than it is in some other areas, especially in health and in transportation. Those are probably the two biggest areas where there's a lot of federal money that's involved.
Where will you take Wyoming from Senate District 10 perspective? Where will you take Wyoming? You talk about what it needs, what you'd like to see for it. What's your vision with where are we going to end up with a vote for you?
I would like to think that we would be, in 4 years from now, that we would be more independent than we are now, not as dependent on federal largesse.
What's our key to our success in that regard? What's the central most important thing that we need from your perspective that will bring us to that success?
We've always been self-reliant, and that was something that's been kind of instilled in me from growing up, and not in a selfish way, but be able to help your next door neighbor. You can't help somebody across the world until you've taken care of your own family. And in a lot of ways, Wyoming is a big family with pretty long streets, but when you think about the size of some of these other states, pretty low population, we need to take care of each other. That doesn't mean that should be a government function. You know, am I taking food every week to the food bank? Am I helping out? When COVID hit, we actually kept a student from Singapore at the house because he stayed here as long as he could stay in the dorms, and by the time things were shut down, he couldn't leave the country and there wasn't any other place to go. So
Wow.
We had a student stay with us for about 3.5 months during COVID.
Interesting. I'd love to know more about that at another time. But as we move on through your interest, why you? Why now? The Senate candidacy. Why?
I mentioned COVID just a moment ago, and that was one of my motivating factors. And face it, I've already had 3 careers, and I don't know whether to say that I want to get off the sidelines or off the bench, but I just felt like it was time to go ahead and for that next push to make a difference.
You'll have a unique perspective, having been a lobbyist. I don't know of another candidate that was a lobbyist for 20 years going in. That's a unique experience. If you were to take an advantage or see an advantage possible out of your 20-year lobbying experience alone, what will you derive from lobbyists or staff or issue by issue? What will make you a better candidate than anyone else because of that experience?
One thing that I've done as a lobbyist that I think will be very helpful is to look at issues from all sides possible. And as a lobbyist, the idea with that is to be able to counter the argument for the side that you're advocating for. And what I've seen with good decision makers in the legislature, they do the same thing, pardon me, and they look at both sides and they actually listen. And that's one of the things that it's not missing, but it's not as deep as it was, to listen to all sides and then come up with with your own position on something. And there are some things that are set. You know, if you have to have principles, or there's no depth that we could fall to if we don't have some principles that underlie how we make decisions as well.
What has the Senate been doing well that, that Albany County's former representative succeeded at or was a part of that you'd like to continue? If anything.
The previous, Senator Dan Furphy's been there now. This is his 4th year of that 4-year term. Glenn Moniz was a senator before that. I had worked with Glenn quite a bit. He was on the Ag Committee at the time when he was in the Senate. He had also been in the House. The place where people really have to rely on one another more than anything else is on appropriations, because there is so much detail in there that it's very hard, and people don't realize how much time those folks on appropriations take.
Why is it so difficult? I don't think many understand. How does it get so difficult?
There's layers to it. There's the one that we can all go up right on the legislative website and we can pull up the budget that they passed this year. And then there's also the detail in each agency. And once you start pulling down all the detail, we're looking at least a couple thousand pages of numbers. And yes, in the budget that you see, there's also all of these coffee cans that are scattered around to fund certain activities, whether that's conservation or easements.
Are these the areas where people complain or comment frequently that it's non-related or not as closely associated with the primary title of the bill?
I would say in Wyoming that is, there are times when people try and legislate through the budget. And if it is giving direction to an agency about how they should dedicate certain funds, that's reasonable. But to put amendments in there to try and get a bill passed that you couldn't get passed on its own is off limits.
With 20 years experience lobbying, might you be the best candidate with respect to knowing the inner workings of the Senate itself?
I would like to think that's true, but it's a little hard to say, not ever actually having been in the Senate. And I can say I do know one person who had been a lobbyist and had served as a senator, and I do think it was an advantage for her. I would also say that I think she was a little more skeptical of all of the lobbyists just because she had been a lobbyist. However, I also think that she's used to that evaluation of lobbyists and fellow senators too.
I was a Laramie Jubilee Days volunteer when Glenn Moniz was on the committee, chairman of that committee, Dallas Talbot and others. And as we go into Laramie Jubilee Days, what's your schedule like in your campaign efforts? Where can people meet you? Where can they see you and get to know you on a one-on-one basis, perhaps?
Well, we're going to be over at Freedom Has a Birthday. Plan to be there all day, so we'd love people to stop by and say hi, visit with us, and get to know me, as well as my wife Jeannie will be there. And we'll also be in the parade later and just be out and about.
And as you were a attendant at the Centennial Valley Volunteer Fire Department in Centennial, Wyoming, that fundraiser What did you learn and derive from that event that will help you as you campaign for Senate, or perhaps prevail and represent Senate 10 in your future?
Centennial Valley's a really unique place, and the fire department is a huge part of the community there. And I know well how that feels because I was a volunteer firefighter for 17 years and an EMT. Actually taught fire science and some EMS to some smaller volunteer departments out in northern Colorado, out on the prairie. And so I know how that's a glue, and I also know that those are the folks that we all expect to keep a level head when everybody else is losing their mind, when things are really stressful. And it was great to be back around those folks again.
One of the things that I picked up in that 3-hour event, noon to 3, delicious pig roast. My taste buds were awoken. But one of the important things that I really gathered was in respect to equipment. There seems to be a lobby for equipment to be of a certain standard, not judged based on performance and capability of fire prevention. The life of these vehicles may get shortened for a volunteer fire district because they don't currently have certain features or modern technologies not integrated into them like there's equipment available today. What would you do to protect firefighting happening in a local way as our next senator?
I visited with Mark Armstrong quite a bit about that, and you're referring to a proposed OSHA rule. And on the face of it, it seems ridiculous to me. I had been involved with increasing the fire rating, if you will, which directly affects insurance rates for houses. One thing about fire departments, especially volunteer departments, when you look around, they focus on where the greatest need is, but they want to cover all their bases. So they have that structure fire pumper there that, according to those proposed rules, would be out of date. Yet it's seen very limited use, and really it's hard to fathom what the idea is behind this, because maintenance is such a big portion of what fire departments do, because when the bell rings, you have to go, and it needs to be ready to go. And I don't feel that that's lessened their safety. Given the current federal environment, I have to think that some of this is an effort to move people to the 15-minute city, for lack of a better way to put it. And one of the other things that really concerns me with that, a lot of the equipment that these rural departments use come from the state forestry department, and they take surplus military vehicles and go through and recondition those and bring them back up so that they can continue their useful life and minimize the cost. And the other thing is, in a lot of situations, those are the only vehicles that can get around.
I'm not aware of it specifically for Centennial Valley Volunteer Fire Department, but you can't, if this type of legislative action goes through prohibiting older equipment from being, it would potentially impact whether our firefighting crews could go and assist on a federal lands fire in Oregon or wherever they might. And there's a lot of revenue that's derived for a fire department in that mutual benefit way.
That's true, but then it's also, I want to go back just a little bit, and you said legislative action. It's not. It's administrative action.
Oh, yes. Okay, good.
And that's where I think as states we have to push back harder, and on the federal level, the REINS Act is something that we've been advocating for years, that if an administrative agency makes a rule that Congress believes is counter to its intent, they should be able to overrule it. And we've built this administrative state up now for over 110 years, and that's the biggest elephant in the room. And we've got to start taking it one bite at a time and go back. And I think that the state ought to and can be more aggressive. And I certainly think that there's other states that would join us in those efforts. We see this more and more in the courts, and it's unfortunate that we have to spend so much money on taking things to court, but there's no other civil way to do that.
The checks and balances system
must
be utilized. You got to go to the judicial branch for that check.
We do, but there's also, think of it at the fire department. Are we going to have to start our own insurance fund to cover everything for those firefighters? If they can't afford that, I would much prefer to have somebody come out and put out the grass fire at my place in a 20-year-old truck than to have to rely on doing it entirely on my own. And face it, the way that started was neighbors all got together and decided to buy their own little fire pumper and do it themselves, and that's what gave rise to volunteer firefighters.
Absolutely, yeah, no doubt. Other topics, as you have entered the Senate 10 race, what are other issues of top concern for voters?
Really, I see three big issues. The first one is education, and there was a good effort made on starting education savings accounts. Unfortunately, the governor vetoed some of that bill, but I think that's one answer to giving parents control, because I believe that until a child is no longer a minor, the parents have the ultimate right and choice on how their children should be educated. Now, whether that takes the form of public school, charter school, homeschooling, but it appears to me that education savings accounts are a great way to allow parents to make that choice. Second thing, and your guest last hour was, you had spoken a little bit about COVID, and we saw so many violations of the Bill of Rights, especially freedom of religion. Can anybody else recall a time anywhere in our country's history where we closed down churches for any reason? And to think of family members that might have been in the hospital and passed away alone or with only one family member. And part of my reluctance on COVID and COVID vaccines goes back to my administrative work in the ag field, where it takes 8-9 years before something's approved and considered safe and efficacious, that it'll work. And that was very frustrating to me with the rollout of the vaccine, that it happened as quickly as it did, and that it was always experimental use. And that was where I really had a problem with that, because when you start to look back at history, that's a violation of the Nuremberg Code. And we tried a lot of people and executed some folks for doing that very same thing, for not allowing fully informed consent. I also think that I really think that the gun-free zone bill this year was one that was passed by the legislature, vetoed by the governor. Some of the issues this year were issues of leadership and personal turmoil that went on in the legislature that could easily have been avoided. And people in Wyoming need to realize that the state executive is a relatively weak executive compared to many other states. And the legislature has a great deal of power, and one of the failures this year was to leave so many things until the last moment.
I know from part of my Candidate Awareness Tour research, over 300 bills stalled out, did not make the floor for consideration in the House of Representatives. There's so many hours and dedicated efforts to put into some of these bills. Why are things not happening on the floor? Why are they not getting consideration fully for the state of Wyoming?
One, I think there are, but there's a very different dynamic during budget session than during general session. And a bill has to get 2/3 vote on the floor just to be introduced unless it's directly affects budget in some way, an appropriation. And so one thing that has changed slightly, there were actually some committee bills that failed introduction that had been worked on during the interim. That's a little bit unusual. There used to be some deference paid to those bills to get them introduced, so they went out to a committee. But I also know that leadership in the House told members on your individual bills, pick which one that you would like to bring up for introduction, because we're not going to be able to get to these. And that's a pretty usual process. And it's also usual that people introduce bills or bring bills out to be introduced during budget session because it's a topic that they think should be looked at during the next general session or during the interim work that's happening now.
It seems like a strategic manipulation to the public.
And I guess my reply to that...
For or against various issues.
My thought on that is it's probably better to have that idea out and then have people look at it over the next year before the next legislature. And yes, there are times when there are urgent things that need to be tended to. But there's also that idea that, here's an idea, we should look at this and we should spend some time and not just jump off in the pond to find out that it's filled with rattlesnakes or gators too.
Right. Very good. You mentioned that you'll be available at Freedom Has a Birthday in Washington Park in the city of Laramie, July 4th. Other ways that people can reach out, ask you questions, involve themselves with your candidacy for Senate 10.
Well, our campaign email is Kennedy4Wyoming, and that's the 4 there is a digit, @wyoming.com. You can look us up on Facebook, Kennedy for Wyoming. We'll have our website up later this week as well, and it's Kennedy4Wyoming.com. We'll also have some things out on X, Twitter, whatever you want to call it. I've actually been used Twitter for 13 or 14 years now, and the only reason I really started on it was because about well, and that was a little after I had started, but most of the staff that work for our congressional representatives, all of them in DC, that's one of their main news sources. And I wanted to feel like I knew kind of what was going on more than actually post anything and all, just be able to see how conversations are going.
So how did you start out with your education and awareness and user friendliness of Twitter, now X?
I just generally check it a couple times a day. I follow 600 some odd people, and I really have appreciated what's happened with that platform since Elon Musk took it over. Yeah, it's a little rougher than it used to be, but you don't get moderated views or throttling like we often see on some of the other platforms.
Very good.
Occasionally.
Very good. Appreciate that observation. And voting, as we understand it, available to military men and women overseas, July 4th, that ballot available. And then July 23rd, absentee vote ballots will be available in Albany County domestically. And then August 20th, that big primary election day.
Yep.
Any suggestions for folks as we wrap up today in this introduction of you, Keith Kennedy, for Senate District 10 in Wyoming?
Well, thanks, Eric. I really appreciated our chat this morning, and we'd like to see everybody get out and vote. Remember, if you aren't registered, you can go down to the county clerk's office and register at any time. You do have to be registered as a Republican to vote for me in the primary, but especially some of the folks that are coming in over at Wyotech. We'd love to have you out, and really interested in making sure that we keep the tradespeople and the folks that make things work represented in the legislature.
If you're just joining us, we're closing our interview segment with Keith Kennedy, Senate District 10 candidate for Wyoming, and this seat vacates by Dan Furphy. Dan Furphy serving 4 years in that capacity for Albany County. If you have questions of our candidates, you can follow their instruction to get a hold of them. You can also alert us at Candidate Awareness Tour 2024, and we'll be sure to get your questions going. We also have announcement next week. We will do the Candidate Awareness Tour we'll have a city night, a county night, a state and federal night, right here in Studio 255 at the Laramie Plains Civic Center. Stay tuned.